talking here with John Steffler, who's the Poet Laureate of Canada at the moment. He's written 5 books of poetry, including The Night We Were Ravenous, which won the 1999 Atlantic Poetry Prize. And his novel, The Afterlife of George Cartwright, is sitting on my bedside table at this very moment. And it won a Smith Books Prize in 1993, and it was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award as well, I believe. John, you taught for over 30 years in Newfoundland, and now you're in Montreal.
Exactly. Yeah.
I heard you're, like many people landing in Montreal, you're chasing a girl.
Yeah, that's what. Well, yeah, it's hard to resist in Montreal because it's famous for its beautiful women, and that's yeah. Yeah, and I'm teaching there at Concordia University as well. I retired from my job in Newfoundland, and rather sadly shifted out of Newfoundland, where I've lived for a long time, and became deeply attached to the land and the people, the culture there. But it's also exciting to be entering a new phase in my life. Yeah.
And how are you finding being the Poet Laureate? What does that involve?
Well, it's a great honor to begin with. I'm just the 3rd Poet Laureate in Canada. George Bowring was the 1st, and then Pauline Michel. So it's a great honor, and I think it's wonderful that Canada has created and supports this position. I think it's really just a kind of a gesture as much as anything toward the importance of literature and writing in our culture. So I find it exciting and a great honor. It's also a bit challenging because there are a lot of invitations to do things such as this, and I try to do as many of them as I can. So I'm very busy with it and do a lot of traveling, a lot of talking and reading.
And do you get enough time in your own head to
tell you the truth, not very much. I'm sort of storing ideas away, and I'm having so many experiences, meeting a lot of new people and traveling and so on. It will have an influence on my writing in the future, but I'm actually busy away from my studies, so to speak, away from my writing, more than I'm actually able to work on it at the moment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How did you get into writing in the first place? Was it poetry or prose or what?
It was mostly poetry. Yes, it was poetry, and it started quite early in my life, in my early teens. And I tell you the truth, I don't really know where it came from. I had a fairly solitary kind of upbringing in a rural area. My sister is 5 years older than me. My brother wasn't born until I was already 6, so she was off at school and I was still at home, and the nearest neighbors were a few miles away, so I had to amuse myself wandering around with a dog. And
where was this?
This was, so it's strange to say, it's just north of Toronto, but at the time it was a rural area. I went to a one-room school. It was a farming area. Now it's all built up. It's near Richmond Hill, near Thornhill, east of those places. But I suppose that kind of solitary life, at least in my case, led to a very active imagination and a desire to find ways of expressing myself and my feelings about the land and things that I encountered and thought about, my relationships with people and so on. So that by the time I was in my adolescence, I began to read very actively, and by the time I was about 14, I was telling people that I was going to be a poet when I grew up. And at that point, Dylan Thomas was probably my favorite poet. I was also very excited about T.S. Eliot, and was beginning to read William Blake and so on. So I got going. I don't know where it came from. My parents weren't particularly literary. Music was important in our home, but writing and painting were the things that interested me.
Mm-hmm. So that was a drive from an early age. What happened when did you go through university with this? Did you follow it up there?
Well, in those days, it wasn't really possible to study creative writing, which I might have done. I don't know for sure. In fact, I boasted that I wasn't going to go to university, that I just wanted to have life experiences and become a great writer. And I left home when I was 18. I hitchhiked to Montreal, got a job on a German freighter as a deckhand, worked my way across the Atlantic, and spent a year hitchhiking around Europe and North Africa to get experience. At the end of that, all I could get was a minimum wage job in a woodworking factory, that kind of thing. I worked as a janitor and so on, and I found that I wasn't going to really be able to support myself. So I went to university, and once again thought that was it. When I'd done my BA, I figured, had enough of this, I'm just going to be a writer. But once again, all I could get was substitute teaching positions and so on. So I kept at it within the university until I got a college, a university teaching job that left me time for writing in the summers and so on. And I often say, because I've done quite a bit of creative writing teaching over the years since, that this is really one of the key issues about being a writer. I mean, it's fine to talk about metaphors and enjambment and imagery, you know, and alliteration and assonance and so on. But I mean, one of the key things to being a writer is figuring out, you know, how on earth you're going to support yourself, have some time and energy for writing at the end of the day, you know. And you know, and this is, you know, one of the things that all writers have to struggle to figure out, unless
so what we all need is a high-paying part-time job.
Something like that, yeah, or a sort of a generous benefactor. So this is always one of the big issues for a young writer, I think. You know, how are you going to make it?
Mm-hmm. What about your poems? How do they come to you, or where do they come from?
From a variety of places. I think reading is always an important source for writing. I think all, you know, young writers need to read a lot and need to read contemporary writing, ideally writing from their own, broadly speaking, from their own culture, you know. But for me, place has always been very important. Again, it probably has to do with the, you know, the way I grew up. The relationship between physical place and culture interests me a lot. The exchange of the way we have an impact on our environment and the way the particular kind of environment in which people live, both the natural and the human-created environment, cultural environment as well as natural environment, the way that influences our lives interests me a lot. And you know, so a lot of my poetry does spring from that investigation of place and the history of place.
So if you live in the plains or the mountains or a big city or
yes.
The island of Newfoundland, you'll be a different writer in each place? Or?
To some extent, yeah. My subject matter will change, I think, a little bit. Very broadly, the underlying themes, I think, will probably be similar, just how place expresses who we are and how our lives really extend beyond the narrow limits of when we were born and when we die. I think that we occupy, in a sense, larger loops that include lives lived before ours. You know, we inherit language, for example, the words we speak, the way we formulate our thoughts. We've inherited to a large extent from countless generations before us, and we will go on having an influence on the land and the culture and the people after us. So I think that I like to think of our lives as being extending much farther into the past and into the future than we often are aware of. So this is very broadly an interest of mine, and it's something that I would look at whether I lived in a city or whether I lived, you know, in a rural place. Just, you know, how there is that connection between history and the individual life, place and the individual life.
Mm-hmm. You must have gone through tough times as a writer too. I mean, what was the hardest part of getting to where you are?
Oh boy, yeah, there have been hard times. I think when I was young, in some ways, you know, young people are blessed with energy and optimism. You know, they have most of their lives ahead of them. But in spite of that, you know, you have to work very hard to make a place for yourself. You know, if you're starting out with nothing in a material sense, in a career sense. Times when I think hard times have been when I've I've been working on projects that I don't really feel have an audience yet and haven't been you know, recognized or accepted. I was fairly lucky in some ways to get good publishers fairly early on, but there were times when I really felt I was working in a vacuum, you know, that there was nobody out there listening or paying attention. That's always hard. I've had periods of bad health and personal troubles, I suppose, like everybody else, which I don't really want to go into now. But yeah, you know, I've had hard times, and I think that those hard times also find their way into making a writer what you know, he or she is, and it's important to not just ignore the hard times, but try to turn them into something fertile.
That sounds great. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
John
Ian.
Steffler, pleasure
Thanks.
to talk with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.